how how Snake River salmon and steelhead declines impact Northwest recreational fishing communities. I want to welcome Bob Rees and Aaron Lieberman, and thank you both for joining us this evening. Bob is here representing recreational fishing people in the lower Columbia River region. He's a 30-year veteran professional fishing guide in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. He was once a biologist, and so understood well the risks of getting involved in initiating a business reliant on wild salmon and steelhead populations. For close to 2 decades, he has fought for habitat protections, proper dam operations, and beneficial climate action legislation to benefit wild salmon and other cold water fishes. He serves on the board of Save Our Wild Salmon, has for many years, and fights for the future of wild salmon and the communities dependent on them. Like Bob, Aaron Lieberman is a Northwest native. He's here today representing fishing people in the central Idaho area, based largely in the Snake River Basin, rivers like the Clearwater, Lochsaw, Salmon, and others. He was born and raised in a small town in Southwest Oregon, and he's guided since he was a teenager, and is now the executive director of the Idaho Outfitters Guides and Association. Before moving into this role, he was the operations manager of the Orange Torpedo Trips, an outfitter that he worked with as a guide for a decade. Welcome, Aaron and Bob. I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm not sure, we didn't quite figure out who was going to speak first, so I'll let Aaron, why don't you start, and we'll follow with Bob and go from there. So great to have you tonight. Thanks.
Yep, alphabetically oriented. I appreciate that. Thank you, Joseph, for those words for the introduction. Hey, folks, I can't see any of you, but I assume you can see me. Thanks for joining. As Joseph introduced, my name is Aaron Lieberman. I'm the executive director of the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association. IOGA, Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association, is a nonprofit business trade association representing and advocating for outfitters and guides across all sectors statewide here in Idaho. I'm also, as Joseph mentioned, a longtime guide. It's been guiding every year since about 2006, 2007, maybe actually earlier than that. In any case, I'm also a member of Governor Little's Salmon and Steelhead Recovery Work Group here in Idaho. I represent an industry that, and I think Bob, you do too, but I represent an industry that has long been negatively impacted by the decline in sport fishing opportunities for salmon and steelhead in their businesses, as well as their communities economically, culturally, and socially. Salmon and steelhead fishing outfitters and guides, while not the single sector within our association, represented a significant constituency within that association, and really an important part of the overall industry in Idaho. And of our rural communities. I'm actually joining this webinar from Salmon, Idaho, which is a fitting namesake and locale to be talking about this issue. Salmon is a community that epitomizes both in metaphor and in fact the shifting currents of history, ecology, economy, culture that connects these fish to rural communities, economies, and to the outfitted fishing industry. Continuing on salmon, this community's namesake, salmon, is a totem. The word totem is appropriate. Totem is defined as a natural object or animal that is believed by a particular society to have spiritual significance and that is adopted by it as an emblem. And salmon chose to name itself for these fish for a reason. It's an incredibly important part of this place, of this culture, and of the activities that surround it. They're represented sufficiently here to warrant being anointed with that term. And yet, the downward arc of Idaho salmon and steelhead threatens to turn this salmon's namesake into nothing short of a cruel irony. As a local salmon, I'm going to quote a fishing outfitter who wrote recently, local fishing outfitter here in Salmon recently wrote in comment to the governor's Salmon and Steelhead Recovery Work Group here in Idaho, quote, "People are hurting here in Salmon, Idaho. Hotels are vacant in October. RV sites are empty. Gas stations are not filled with out-of-town plates filling up for a weekend adventure. and fishing shops don't have answers as to why there are so few fish. I own a rafting company that used to fish for steelhead in Idaho's wilderness, and we have not booked a single fishing trip for 3 seasons. I grew up fishing for steelhead with my grandfather, brother, and uncle, and most importantly, my dad, who taught me all there is to know about steelhead fishing. It breaks my heart that I might not be able to take my kids fishing for Chinook salmon and steelhead as my father did with my brother and I, because we may not have enough fish in the coming years if this dismal trend continues. Another outfitter who lives just down the road here wrote, I live on the Salmon River in Chalice, Idaho. I can see the river coming. I can see the river from my living room. I cannot tell you the last time I saw a salmon in the Salmon River. And I think I bring in those 2 quotes because I think they reflect several things. They reflect a growing frustration and a growing sense of urgency within the rural fishing outfitter and guide communities. Frustration because they're bearing the burden and carrying the cost of the decline of Idaho salmon and steelhead populations, and urgency because they recognize the time for patchwork is behind us. Patchwork solutions is behind us. But they don't see that recognition being played out in public conversation, let alone in policy. To put differently, I think both of those quotes speak to, first, the importance of salmon and steelhead fishing to rural economies, and second, the importance of salmon and steelhead fishing to rural communities, their cultures, continuity, and sense of self. To ground those points, first, socially and culturally, the impacts of diminished returns, reduced opportunity, and loss of traditions impact successive generations within these towns, or the lack of successive generations that stay in these towns. So young people across Idaho, and Governor Little, for those of you who are familiar with Idaho politics and or who are here in Idaho listening in, Governor Little has made it a tenet of his administration that we will keep future generations in Idaho, that we will bring back those who have left. And fundamentally, the basis for the exodus from rural Idaho has much to do with the decline, the diminishing returns of salmon and steelhead, of these anadromous keystone species to these riverine communities. And that impact plays out in these communities. You see kids moving away to Boise and larger metropolitan areas out of state, and not least because of the lack of opportunity for the recreational economy that is burgeoned in lieu of extractive industry. Additionally, it affects, I think, these communities' sense of self. So as these fish and those opportunities decline, they lose a sense of who they are. If I'm not a fishing outfitter or a fisherman, who am I? Like, where does that leave me? How do I identify myself and know myself in my place, in this place that informed my person? So these activities are, we talk about fishing like this sidelong thing, but these activities, fishing in connection to fish is an inextricable part of identity in places like rural Idaho. Economically, which is always a driving force, and certainly what gets most attention, the numbers or the content is even more staggering, I think. In 2018, and I was going to try to do this more seamlessly, but I will try to share now on the screen here. Folks, let me know if you cannot see it. But in 2018, it's actually this next one. Bear with me. There we go. So in 2018, 650-ish thousand anglers in Idaho spent an aggregate of $757 million fishing in Idaho. Specifically in terms of the outfitted component, which is this initial slide I had here. Nope. The Zoom world. So specifically in terms of the outfitted component, the Idaho Department of Commerce has recently done some modeling for us, estimating a $1.2 billion economic contribution to the state economy by outfitters and guides in aggregate. If you extrapolate from that, the proportion of that overall use So of the 222,000 roughly folks who come to Idaho to engage in outfitted activities per year, roughly 15% of those are coming for anadromous fishing trips. That equates to, again, roughly $180 million directly just through outfitted impact on to the state economy. I think maybe more tellingly is this next point, which is that 80% of outfitters and guides in Idaho live in and operate out of communities with an average population of 500 or fewer. So we take that 1.2 billion altogether, and that 180 million just for salmon and steelhead fishing, and we couch that in populations across Idaho, these rural communities with an average population of 500 or fewer, and that impact becomes astronomical. In Limhi, Custer County, the overall employment total employment is about 34% through outdoor recreation industry. The businesses and economies of riverine towns and regions in rural Idaho rely in no small part, as these numbers demonstrate, I think, on the shoulder and off-season earnings they receive from tourism generated by guided salmon and steelhead fishing. Catherine Tackey, who works with the Idaho Department of Labor, recently several months ago now, quoted saying a lot of businesses couldn't survive without that associated tourism. It might only be 10% of their business, but it's that percent that makes them profitable. That economic impact has a ripple effect in local economies on public perception of those places as destinations, and the tax revenue that helps those places improve their infrastructure, keep roads up and going, utility services, marketing, and so on, that make them tourist destinations and places that people want to make their homes. On the number of heads and beds and the folks at local cafes, diners, buying gas, coming back next year because they had that positive, memorable experience. The importance of these fish, salmon and steelhead, and the outfitting guiding industry to these rural Idaho communities truly can't be overstated. And yet fishing outfitters, as said earlier, and their guides and their communities continue to helplessly watch the downward arc of Idaho's anadromous fish. That hardship is not hypothetical. It's not this hypothetical future contingency in which they might be hurting. It is real, it's immediate, and it's been long endured. The community I represent in some continues to bear an inordinate burden, an inordinate share of the burden of the impacts of the current system, in particular of the hydro system and its associated industries and mechanics, and loss of livelihood, cultural continuity, and generational collapse. For these reasons, not least for the moral imperative to forestall the extinction of a keystone species, the association I represent, Idaho Outfitters Guides Association, has for over 2 decades and continues to support the retirement of the lower four Snake River dams, the most viable means to restore abundant populations of anadromous fish. I also had in here in the slides, and I could share here briefly, that most recent resolution. But for now, I'll just say, we've tried everything else. We've tried habitat. Idaho boasts the most pristine habitat in the world for anadromous fish, and yet we continue to see declines. And all longitudinal evidence points us to the same thing, and has pointed us to the same thing for years. It's an evidence-based conclusion. It's not emotional. We spend so much time discussing the hypothetical pain, and I continue myself to spend so much time discussing the hypothetical pain of other people and potential futures. But again, I represent a community in this state, and myself am part of a community in the state that has been suffering for decades due to the lack of acknowledgement of the current state of things and how we can change that in our own communities, in our states, and in our region. It's well past time that we as a state and a region, therefore, stop pretending that this issue is more complex than it is, that we don't understand what we have to do, and that we just do that thing. Hard things are hard, but we can do hard things. We split the atom, we put a man on the moon. We can find a way to restore these fish. I think that's all.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate that those comments. Bob, do you want to say a few things before we open up to question and answer?
Sure. Well, first thing I'll say is Aaron sure doesn't make me want to move to Idaho. Thanks for that. I thought we had a bad downstream of Bonneville Dam, but I just want to again introduce myself as Bob Rees, a 30-year fishing guide and executive director for the Northwest Guides and Anglers Association. Collectively, we represent about 65 businesses, charters, and fishing guides in the state of Oregon and Southwest Washington. Collectively, my members represent tens of thousands of sport angler trips every year, largely taking place on the Columbia River. It's a mainstay for our industry. Collectively, sport fishing in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington, of which the Columbia River runs through each one of those states, as Aaron had indicated, is worth $3.5 billion annually to the local economies. And as what Aaron said, when we define local economies, we're talking about small towns like Clackamas, Oregon, or Cascade Locks, or the Dalles, or Rainier. Our industry represents wealth from urban live in those small communities again.
Uh-oh. Bob?
An incredible resource, the industry that we represent, for those transfer of dollars from urban and rural communities. A lot of folks recognize that my internet connection is unstable. Is that right?
You were cutting out a little bit. We'll keep our fingers crossed that you stabilize.
Very good. That's not the first time I've been called unstable. Again, I just want to say, a lot of our customers, we bring them from the cities. They come specifically out to these rural areas to recreate, to enjoy natural areas that don't exist in urban areas, and certainly to take advantage of these incredible fish and wildlife resources that we get to utilize in different capacities. I want to also mention that, there's no longer such a thing as a full-time fishing guide. We don't get to make a full-time living at this any longer like I did even 15 and 20 years ago. The resource just doesn't exist, whether we're talking about salmon or steelhead or sturgeon. Those are keystone species for the Pacific Northwest and iconic species, what people travel to from all over the world, because those populations are decimated on the East Coast, they're decimated in Europe. And the West Coast is the last remaining stronghold, if you can really define that as a stronghold, to get the state of the situation of wild salmonids. We historically in the Columbia River, once the World Year of Wild Salmon Steelhead, routinely saw between 15 and 17 million wild salmon back to the river system prior to European settlement. In comparison, these days, on a very good year, we might see 1.5 to 1.8 million, sometimes 2 million salmon back to the Columbia River system, of which about 85% of those are from hatcheries. So we've reduced wild runs of fish from 15 to 17 million to just a few 100,000, representing between 1 and 2% of their historic abundance. As far as what's going on this year, in the year 2020, we're going to see some of the most reduced and abbreviated seasons that we've ever seen in my history as a fishing guide. Spring Chinook numbers, we got about four or 5 days of opportunity for spring Chinook on the main stem Columbia River. Summer Chinook is closed for the second or third year in a row. Summer steelhead will be incredibly abbreviated this year on the main stem Columbia. Fall Chinook season, which is the most abundant of the 5 species of salmon that run in the state, we're going to have one of the shortest seasons that I've seen in my 30 years of guiding. We have about 14 days to try and make a living on the lower Columbia this year. And then the coho run is just flat out decimated this year. We're going to have very little opportunity for that. So our industry is hurting, and frankly, not a lot of it has to do with the COVID pandemic. It has to do with the fact that a combination of river conditions, the warm water blob, the El Nino series that we had during outmigration in 2015 and 2016. But of course, when it comes to factors that can be controlled by humans, how do these fish survive in the freshwater ecosystems based on river function is what is having the greatest impact on our industry. And I'm going to share a couple slides here. This is the section
Hey, Bob.
Yeah.
You haven't. Oh, there we go.
Sorry.
You're up.
A little faster than it should be. Is it showing to you yet?
It is.
Okay. Not quite on my my phone, but so yeah, this is the Columbia River that I'm referencing. You can see Bonneville Dam here. I talked mostly about the 140-mile stretch down to the river. I just want to put that in perspective. Aaron is way upriver, well above McNary Dam. I want to show these graphs. Are those coming up okay?
Your screen hasn't shifted yet.
Wow, I don't know why that's so slow. Sorry if that hasn't shown up yet. Basically, these graphs, I'm going to just stop sharing.
Let me share my screen and see if I can bring those up.
Okay.
Maybe this isn't going to work. Well, I'm sorry. I'm not going to be able to do that.
Okay. Yeah, that's weird. So what I wanted to talk about basically is what is the impacts of the hydropower system on salmonids. This graph that I have, I'm sorry we can't share it, shows that for the juvenile phase of fall Chinook, for example, I'll try and make this quick here because there's a lot of information to cover, but hydropower's impacts on juveniles rates somewhere in the high 80% range for mortality for juveniles. The adults, when they return to spawn, we lose not quite 30% of adults when they migrate up through the system. In comparison, predatory fish, birds, and pinnipeds, and their relation, particularly fish and birds. We get this question a lot from fishermen, is like, and for that matter, we get it a lot from Bonneville Power Administration. They've got a whole multi-million-dollar program to remove native pike minnows from the Columbia River, when in fact they are just a small portion of the predation that takes place on these juvenile salmonids. Predatory fish and birds, for example, maybe make up about 12 or 13%. Adult pinnipeds on the adult salmonid populations probably make up about 3 to 4% of fall Chinook mortality. And then the ocean and the river fisheries that take place for adult salmonids, collectively about 40% of the adults are taken. Most of those adults are taken in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia before they make it back to the river systems. But of course, there's a tremendous benefit equated with the harvest of those fish, both for the commercial and the sport fishing industries. But on a relative scale, hydropower takes by far the vast majority of accounting for both juveniles and adult salmonids as they migrate through the river system. As far as returns this year, spring Chinook adult return this year so far is 54,657. The 10-year average for spring Chinook adults is 142,500. So drastically down, almost a third down what the 10-year average is. Jack counts, which is an indicator of how next year is going to perform. This year's jack counts are 5,111. The 10-year jack count is 18,657. So again, about a third down of what recent abundance is. And that's what I had for slides. I just want to conclude, and we're looking forward to taking some questions, but there have been some Band-Aid fixes on the Columbia River as far as flow and spill regime goes. We've of course had to win those in court. We've been to court on flow and spill on the Columbia River to better out-migration conditions for juvenile salmonids, I believe 5 times. We've won each time. the court rules in our favor. But we don't feel that we should be fighting the federal government, the federal fish agencies that are in charge of recovering these runs of fish, to fight for better conditions for them. This is a process that we're again undertaking right now with the draft environmental impact statement, trying to make conditions better for fish. Yet year after year, we fight the federal government for better conditions for these fish. And I just want to conclude by stating, that our industry, of course, is the social and economic benefits of sport fishing can't be understated. But this crisis is really bigger than just our industry. As Aaron also indicated, a keystone species, which is defined as a species, an animal that has a disproportionate amount of benefit to its regional ecosystem. Without salmon, a lot of the ecosystem suffers by both terrestrial and aquatic habitats and flora and fauna. And so, we will continue to sit on the sidelines as long as we need to make sure salmon survive into the future. We've done it before, we'll do it again. But I want to emphasize again that the greatest amount of mortality takes place in the hydropower system. And again, as Aaron had pointed out, there are ways to solve this crisis. We are, as a coalition, doing it through engaging with our federal elected officials, to encourage them to bring communities that are affected, impacted, farming and barging and certainly fisheries, bring them together to have a collaborative community conversation and find solutions so that we can have a win-win-win situation on the Columbia River.
Thank you, Bob and Aaron, for those introductory comments. I don't know if, Bob, that someone's put Aaron's slide back up, and if it's possible, we could pull those off just so folks can see the speakers. But what I want to let folks know is that, if assuming it's okay with Aaron and Bob, we'll post the PowerPoint materials that they were showing or we were attempting to show in the discussion right now on our webinar webpage, this evening or tomorrow, so you can take a look at those images and graphs and so forth. So we'll shift now into the question and answer phase, and I've got a couple questions for you both, but I've seen a couple of questions come in. Just as a reminder, people can, if you've got a question that you want to ask our speakers, you could preferably use the question and answer box that's available at the bottom of your screen, or you could also put it in the chat box. Either way works. There's a question from Max that just asks the speakers to please describe the recreational opportunities that we could expect to see on a Snake River that has been restored, that the 4 federal dams have been removed in eastern Washington.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to take a first crack, Bob, unless you want to go.
Go ahead.
All right. Yep, law of verbal traps. Here we go. I suppose to start, the answer is a hypothetical one. We don't know with certainty. What we do know is extrapolations, strictly on the sport fishing side, of what returns and therefore opportunities could and would look like with the retirement of the lower 4 Snake River dams and the restoration of the Snake River system. And that is a manifold increase in returns. Even in the absolutely embarrassing draft EIS recently released, they predicted 4-fold increases in returns across different stocks and population groups, at least in terms of Idaho stocks, Snake River stocks, which are the primary spawners for the system. Beyond that, though, I think it's a really interesting question because, you know, there's so much conversation about, well, if we get rid of these reservoirs, then what about all the power boaters? What about the barges that come up? I mean, we're to say nothing of, there are 63 named rapids with a gradient profile. I'm a rafter myself, but 63 named rapids with an impressive gradient profile in those now buried sections of river. And the opportunity for recreation, economically and just in terms of joy that represents, is huge. I mean, these are very unique big water sections of river. There aren't many places in the United States, let alone more broadly, where you have that kind of volume combined with that type of gradient. And that would bring both power boaters and rafters, kayakers, even beyond fishing. Not to say nothing of the actual sort of riverside restoration that could happen there for businesses. So, you know, when you have a free flowing river where you can set up a bar or a grill or whatever, a park, like a walkway, any of those things, where now you just have these industrial reservoirs of non-flowing river. So I guess somewhat in short, they're huge. There's huge potential there.
And I would add, we got a taste of that before. Now, Aaron's just a young whippersnapper. Of course, I'm an old man. But back in the early 2000s, you might recall, I don't know if the person asked the question is a sport fisherman or not, or sport fisherwoman, but we had a return of spring Chinook back to the Columbia in 2001, I believe it was. That was in excess of 450,000 adults, by far one of the largest returns maybe we've seen, you know, since before European settlement here. We had a 7-day week season, a 2-fish bag limit. We got the fish all the way to the base of Bonneville Dam. Sport anglers harvested about 25,000 spring Chinook that year. And the effect upstream, clear into Idaho, there were fishing guides leaving Oregon to go fish in Idaho as the spring Chinook made their way up there. An incredible feat happened. We had, it was just those fish that migrated out and came back as adults that year. They migrated out during the flood of 96. So basically the river system functioned once again as a river. What I didn't even realize, I have a degree in fisheries technology, but I didn't find out until years after I had left college that these fish that migrate, that once used to take 7 to 10 days of leaving from Idaho to get to the Columbia River estuary, now take upwards of 30 days to do that, because they're trying to navigate themselves through a series of reservoirs versus a functioning river ecosystem that existed prior to the construction of the dams and the reservoirs. These fish don't just turn and start swimming west. They actually have to get pushed down. Their noses are always in the current. If there's no current pushing those fish down, they'll never make it to the river system, or they'll expend a great deal of energy and time and become susceptible to warm water disease and predation in those reservoirs trying to get to the Columbia River estuary, and therefore survival rates are very low. In 96, when we had the flood in 96, the river system, for lack of a better term, I apologize in advance, trumped the current system that we have. These fish are trying to, again, make their way through a series of reservoirs that have very little flow to them versus the massive water push that we got back in 96. And then on top of that, they went into highly productive ocean conditions that formed this incredible return of adult salmon that we haven't seen in decades and decades in the Columbia. So we know
sorry, just I was gonna say, if I could just real quickly, just to Bob, I appreciate that response. I mean, I know the question was about recreation, but I appreciate what you're saying. And to ground that even further, this year the fall Chinook forecast in Idaho was downgraded to about 72,000. The season closed on the Salmon River. Will close Sunday, giving them virtually no fishing days. It's historically low returns. And to the question of a number around 450,000, historically pre-dam installation, we were actually looking at returns of millions. and that's to Idaho. That's not just Columbia. That's Idaho. So the economic opportunity in those returns, to your point, is incredible. I mean, it's truly hard to wrap our heads around because we've been dealing with a shifting baseline for so long. But I'll go on a rant if I keep on going, so I'll pass it back to you, Joseph.
I'll just chime in with a couple of facts and then move on. Restoring the lower Snake River by removing 4 federal dams will restore 140 miles of river, which, as Aaron said, has between 60 and 70 named rapids before they were inundated. That's a tremendous economic resource if you just want to sort of think about it in those terms. River rafting opportunities, restored lands, about 14,000 acres will be restored, riparian habitat, great bottomlands, great hunting, bird watching, hiking, running, and so forth. I mean, there's a real opportunity there to restore a landscape and then the activities that it will support. The Fish Passage Center, I was active with Governor Inslee's Orca Task Force over the last couple of years, and the Fish Passage Center made a presentation to the Orca Task Force that predicted for spring Chinook, that's just one of the listed in the at-risk stocks in the Snake River system, we would see between 600,000 and 1.1 million spring Chinook returning to the mouth of the Columbia, many of which would be heading up into central Idaho and the Snake River Basin, because it's very, very productive historically spring Chinook habitat. So the restoration potential, in addition to a restored river and all the benefits that it would bring in terms of fishing, sport, commercial, tribal, is tremendous. And I'll just one last fact to add. 20 years ago, there was a federal study, an EIS process, environmental impact statement, that was assembled, and the Army Corps of Engineers hired a environmental economist, John Loomis, to explore and understand what the economic outdoor recreation potential was 20 years ago. And his finding was between $80 million a year and almost $500 million a year, $500 million. Of course, in the final report, the Corps chose the lower number and said, they sort of are famous for undercounting benefits of things they don't want to do. But the point here is there's, economists have looked at this question and come up with determinations of tremendous value, much of which would be, delivered to the small rural communities that are close to the river and the ones that Bob and Aaron are both speaking to. So thanks for that. Another question coming in from Lizzie has a question, Bob. She'd like to get your perspective on the Columbia compact states, Oregon and Washington, voting to extend the spring Chinook season when the Clearwater closed in Idaho. How can states better coordinate and communicate?
Yeah, well, they do a lot of coordination and communication. The situation that happened at the last compact call was pretty amazing in the fact that staff had presented opportunity for sport fishermen as well as commercial gillnet fleet to have prosecuted fisheries on the main stem below Bonneville Dam. And through public testimony, sport and commercial fishermen had simply stated, after they heard some of the testimony from Idaho, that they likely weren't going to make hatchery egg take. Public testimony was just like, this doesn't make sense. Let's not prosecute a fishery. Let's make sure hatchery fish get back to Idaho. Let's bolster what little wild fish are coming back into the system. And so after a collective, not collaborative, but a collective voice coming from sport and commercial fishermen, they decided to not reopen opportunity on the Columbia River based on public input. And I think the agencies might have been headed that way anyway, especially after the Idaho testimony. So there is definitely dysfunction that happens in the compact call. There is definitely underrepresentation in Idaho. Thankfully, the biologist that spoke up on behalf of Idaho made it very clear the dire situation that was happening in that state as far as returns go. And everybody collectively decided to make the right decision. So it is somewhat unfair. A large amount of those spring Chinook in particular are hatched and raised, reared, and sent down from Idaho for Oregonians and Washingtonians to take advantage of. And then you guys get abbreviated seasons on the back end. I don't, against my own benefit, that is an unfair situation that probably needs to be looked at. But the fact of the matter is that if we had proper operations of these hydropower systems, we wouldn't be fighting over the last scraps that exist on this Columbia River. And so, it's vitally important that we address those issues, but it's even more critical that we address the bigger fish to fry in the basin, which is the Columbia hydropower system and how to get people to work together to solve these problems. And one other thing I just want to point out is that we're seeing some incredible wild salmon return rates on both the Sandy and the Clackamas rivers. They don't have near the hydropower systems to navigate, but the Clackamas River has 3 dams on it. And PGE that operates those facilities are passing between 94 and 96% of wild coho, wild spring Chinook, and wild steelhead on that river system. PGE is doing it right. We can have dams and we can have recovering populations of wild Salmonids. At this point, I never ever thought I'd say this, particularly about spring Chinook, is that the spring Chinook, the wild spring Chinook returns on the Clackamas River are by far outpacing the hatchery returns on that system. One of the few in the entire Columbia Basin. The other one is the Sandy River. Folks might remember that Marmot Dam was torn down, and that river system too is recovering. I talked to a fishing guide friend of mine that fished the Sandy this whole spring. They're catching way more wild spring Chinook than hatchery spring Chinook on that system. When you treat an ecosystem, a river system, the way these fish have evolved over time and return function to those river systems, the fish will respond.
Aaron, you want to chime in on the compact or your view from Idaho?
Yeah. So, I would just say in sequence, and I'll try to keep myself abbreviated here, but first, like Lizzie's question is a good one, and frankly one that I share and makes me angry. And Bob, I believe I'm correct in saying that they did extend the season in Oregon and Washington. Right. So where Idaho did not and has yet, to my knowledge, met root stock. It'll be, I think, the first time, and actually I believe Lizzie could probably chime in on that, but the first time that the Vorshak has not done so. And so Idaho does bear and continues and has for a long time borne inordinate impacts from in that system. But I think probably the more important point is another one of your introductory points there, Bob, which is we can spend our time fighting over scraps. We can spend our time pointing down in Oregon, Washington, and frankly, I spend some of my time doing that. But we can spend our time doing that, or we can acknowledge that the fundamental problem that we're talking about here has not to do with how, like, the incremental amount that we get, but with the overall amount that we should have. This shifting baseline has pushed us into a place where we're having a conversation where, Bob, I'm looking at you downstream and saying you're taking too many of my fish, when the fundamental problem is we need more fish. We need to have more fish than this. And there's a reason we don't have this many fish, and we know what that reason is, and we can solve this problem. Let's solve that problem instead of tearing ourselves apart.
Aaron?
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to segue based on what you were just saying into taking a stab at answering this question from Lodestar. The first speaker said the solution was simple. Can he explain? So you just talked about the problem. Can you talk a little bit about what your view is of sort of major elements of what a solution looks like?
Sure. Yeah, and I'd say, in fairness, the solution the solution itself is simple. The mechanics of the solution clearly are not simple, but they are solvable problems. And I suppose that's probably a better way to put this, is that the fundamental problem, and Bob, you spoke to this, and I wish we did, I'd seen that graph, I wish we had that as well, but the fundamental problem, and I brought up a screen earlier, which has some of the judicial opinions that you referenced, not least the cases, not least the scientific evidence, which is overwhelming and longitudinal, demonstrating that the most viable mechanism toward restoring an abundant returns of salmon and steelhead is in the removal of portions, in particular of the hydro system, in particular the lower four Snake River dams. Now, whenever that is said, it's a politically charged topic, and so people say, well, what are you going to do about the farmers? What are you going to do about the irrigators? What are you going to do about so on and so forth? And I'd say those are all valid questions. And one of my close friends is a farmer up outside Cottonwood. I would sooner not fish a day in my life than hurt him. But we can solve that problem. That's a solvable problem. The problem that we can solve all of these problems except for extinction. We can drill deeper wells for irrigation. We can build a new rail line that not only opens up new ports and new opportunities for those grain producers, but is cost effective relative to the barging system. We can solve all of the base load. Like base load is, though it gets much attention, it's frankly one of the easier things to solve. Not least to get rid of the captive markets that we have here in Idaho, and I'm sure in places in Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington. So we can solve all of the problems except for the extinction of this species. And that's the problem that we need to solve. The good news is we know how to do that. Science has told us that the removal of the lower four Snake River dams is the most viable means toward restoring abundance of salmon and steelhead toward saving these species. So let's do that thing. We can do hard things. Hard things are hard, but we can do them. Let's just do it. Investment, I guess, is how we invest in those things and those solutions. All it takes is money in this case, and will and courage.
Bob, anything to add?
I can't follow that up. Just a point of clarification. Yes, there was a season extension. There was going to be, I think, a third extension, and that's when public testimony in the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho agreed not to have that third extension. So, yeah, you're right. There was at least one extension.
There's a number of questions coming in that get at, I think, unpacking a little bit, Aaron, the topic you were just addressing, what the solution, and then of course, how do we make that happen? The region's been talking about restoring Lower Snake River for a couple of decades. That conversation and momentum and urgency, because of the state of fish, has increased in the last couple of years, and I think a lot of people, myself included, see a tremendous opportunity before us right now, but we've got to act quickly. So I'm going to sort of follow up on a couple of questions that relate to different aspects of where we go from here and how do we get out of this fix we've put ourselves in. One question I want to ask you about, you mentioned it at the beginning in your introductory comments, is I think your involvement in Governor Little's salmon working group. Can you spend just a couple minutes talking about sort of what that is, where it came from, and sort of the conversation around these issues in there? Is that an opportunity? Are we making progress in Idaho with that conversation? That sort of thing.
Yeah, so to the working group, where it certainly came from Representative Simpson and his remarks at the Andrews Center conference. Oh, the years are blurry. Was that last year, Joseph?
I think it was 14 months.
Was that last year? Man, it feels like a decade. So it was, so to speak, spawned from that. But really, I mean, as I think you mentioned, the sense of urgency that had waxed and waned and come and crested at different points over the decades, but that certainly had come again to a peak with the closure of the steelhead season that preceding the Andrews conference. So the working group came out of that, not least a general recognition that when we're facing the extinction of keystone species, we should maybe acknowledge that's a fact. in terms of that how that has run its course thus far, or what the opportunities are there, I think it's probably more important to focus on the opportunities. It's, as my sister always said, it's easy to be the critic, and certainly from within, it's also easy to be the critic. But I think what is new, what that represents that is new is that we do have these disparate interests and stakeholders coming together, and sometimes those conversations aren't productive, and sometimes they aren't the conversations we want to have, but most of the time they are driving toward the conversation that we absolutely have to have. And the urgency that still informs that, not least from folks who come and testify and remind us that this is important, is something that I find really valuable in the working group. And I still do have hope for it. I think that having the point of dialogue is dialogue in and of itself. That is first and foremost the point of doing the thing. If you go in with a preconception of what the outcome is going to be, best case scenario, you will oftentimes be disappointed. But having the conversation is the first and most important part. In terms of where I think, well, I guess I could go on. I'll leave it there for a moment, unless you want me to go on a particular point there.
No, that's helpful. Can you just, Aaron, just quickly describe its trajectory? It started last summer, and it is going to conclude this end of this year with a report?
It started last June, I believe, and was set. I'm on it, I should know, but was set to go through December. For the several months ago, from the governor's office and Office of Species Conservation, it was conveyed that they would likely go longer than that, 2 to 3 years potentially, but with an initial output expected by December. So we are in the process as a working group of putting together recommendations across the 4-H's ocean predation that we think will be meaningful toward salmon, or toward accomplishing the express mission of that committee, of that work group, which is to restore abundant, healthy, and harvestable populations of salmon and steelhead to Idaho. So it's looking like it will be a longer process, Joseph, but in the short term, the immediate goal is to provide these policy recommendations, including some surrounding hydro, by December.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Ongoing process. I think just notable that there are other conversations in the region underway, working in parallel in related ways, and in various ways, either tackling or in some cases not, the issue of the fate and future of the Lower Snake River dams, which has been it's in many ways hasn't really been a discussion topic in the region until recently. And I think we have your Congressman, Mike Simpson, to thank a lot for really forcing that conversation open. It's a difficult one, but it's underway, and I know it's at play in with you and the working group.
Well, and for Save Our Wild Salmon, the work you do, one hope that I do have is that these silos of work groups and committees in Oregon, Idaho, Washington can come together. I mean, in some form or fashion, whether through the letter to the governor, encouraging him to reach out to our Idaho state governor, encouraging him to reach out to the governor's board in Washington to engage in that dialogue and have those conversations. But I would hope that those working groups could come together to have a more meaningful dialogue, because as we know, this solution relies fundamentally on congressional action and regional involvement.
Yeah. A related question. How are you planning? This is from one of our guests or attendees. How are you planning with your associations to put pressure on Bonneville and the Corps of Engineers to make the right decisions concerning fish? It's a good question, and it's a tough answer. Aaron or Bob?
I'd be happy to, but I've been talking too much. Bob, would you like to start?
Sure. So how do we put pressure on Bonneville? That's basically the question. Is that right?
And Army Corps of Engineers to make the right decision concerning the fish.
Yeah. Well, so a lot of it has to do with, I really consider Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition kind of the hub of strategy when it comes to this. They've been around for 30 years, as Joseph mentioned. I've been involved for about 25 years. We have bi-weekly meetings. We've been have bi-weekly meetings for 25, 30 years. So there's always an active strategy going on. Joseph is a mastermind at coordinating that effort. We have repeated, it's kind of a learning process. I mean, the sport, and some folks are asking about what is the sport fishing specifically doing about it? Well, relatively speaking, the sport fishers on this particular issue have only been organized on this for about 25 or 30 years, a lot of it in thanks to Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition. But we're finding better ways to talk to our elected leaders. The fish and the orca are doing a lot of the speaking for us. These people, the general population is elevating the crisis that's at hand. Certainly a mother carrying around her baby orca calf for 19 days in Puget Sound speaks volumes as to what we're facing here. We have the science that shows how to recover these fish and what is causing their demise. And as Aaron has said, and gaining the political will to change the trajectory to showing our elected officials what needs to happen. The Congress is in charge of the Corps of Engineers, and I think to some degree Bonneville Power Administration as well. And so until we move our elected leaders to a place where on a bipartisan level, the whole nation can care about whether salmon are going to stay on the face of in Pacific Northwest states, that's the uphill battle we're facing. And of course, just as we were making momentum in this conversation with our elected officials, the pandemic strikes us. Racial equality is full frontal, and of course those are critical things, and frankly even myself, who depends on wild salmon, would say those two issues take precedent over a declining salmon population. But we need to solve those issues. We need to keep salmon, steelhead, and orca on top of our elected leaders' radar. We're doing that by attending town halls, by writing letters to the editor, by having people email their local officials and phone call. We had a rather robust turnout of public comment for the draft environmental impact statement that the Corps of Engineers and BPA put forth in late March. So our voices are being elevated. We're getting better at it every year. We still have to just get the elected official to prioritize this issue.
Aaron, do you want to weigh in on that question?
Sure do. Yeah, I'd say the question is about shifting BPA Army Corps. And Bob, as you said, they're first and foremost, what that means from global to local is congressional action and interest. And to start, we've created a monster. We've created this bloated and subsidized bureaucracy with little to no oversight that is charged both with providing cheap power and with restoring salmon and steelhead, or mitigating against their demise, which is a more tragic way of putting it. And that fundamentally is a problem. So at its base, part of it means reconfiguring the Bonneville Power Administration. So taking away the requirement or shifting the requirement and the burdens put upon them for salmon and steelhead mitigation. Structurally, that is the top level. More maybe practically for the folks listening in, and or for what our associations can do, I would look to the local level again. And I spoke in my initial comments about the fact that rural Idaho and I think the rural West, that outfitting and guiding is indistinguishable from these things. If you go, I was on a panel in salmon about a year ago, and I asked everybody to raise their hands if they were an outfitter. Raise your hands if you're a guide. Raise your hands if you're related to an outfitter guide. Raise your hands if you provide an essential service to outfitters and guides, or if that is the basis of your business. And by the end of that panel in a small room in Salmon, Idaho, where I am now, with 150 people, there were maybe 5 who hadn't raised their hands. I'll say that one of the things we can do is focus in on the community level and combine and explain how these things are connected. So, for example, Salmon River Electric will pay about $6 million, or last year paid about $6 million for their energy purchase. And and 2 million of that roughly from a very small number of people went toward having fewer fish. They were paying several $1,000,000 to have fewer fish to Bonneville Power, who was tasked with giving them cheap power and restoring their fish. And they're kind of failing on both fronts. They haven't completely failed in the cheap power part yet, but the energy market is becoming more competitive and shifting, and they haven't caught up yet. Their debt portfolio is not looking great. So part of the conversation is not necessarily to hammer down on Bonneville, but to go to these rural communities and say, you've been sold a bad bill of goods. You've been told that you have to pay money to suffer more. That you have to pay this money to keep your cheap power, and that means that you don't get to have as many fish in reality. And having fewer fish means that you have a less robust economy with less diversity, resilience in shoulder seasons, which is essential to these rural economies. And that means in turn that your kids are going to move to Boise, or they're going to move to Spokane, or they're going to move somewhere else where there's more opportunity. So it's framing for them a more complete narrative than just saying we want fish back because fish. I mean, I want fish back because fish, but to actually change people's minds, you have to connect their pocketbook to their hearts, to their structural situation, to generations, and tell them the story of what it means and how you can get to a place where on their local level, they have more salmon, their kids stay around, and their power is still not breaking the bank. And I think we can do that. And the good news is we can do that. The good news is that we have all those answers, that they're there. We can, that I think is how that is how we move Bonneville. That's how we move Army Corps. It's fundamentally, we do need, Bob, to your point, we do need to move our congressional delegations respectively, but our congressional delegations will move with county commissioners. They'll move with local power co-ops and PUDs. They'll move when we frame to the constituents of all of those respectively, why this is not just in their interest economically or culturally, but all of those things, why this is a total narrative that gets them to a better future.
And one thing too, if I could just add, I think one thing that we've talked about in the Willamette system, which there's a lot of similar situations happening in the Willamette as there's the Columbia, is that we need to explore the real possibility of actually shifting funds. I mean, Bonneville Power Administration and the Corps of Engineers should be the ones bringing funding forward for restoration of these species, but they were never designed to do fish restoration. Our local Fish and Wildlife agencies, I have a lot of faith in the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I think probably Aaron does with Idaho, and hopefully the same in Washington. They're the ones charged with fish restoration and recovery. Bonneville builds hydropower system. The Corps of Engineers builds infrastructure. They should not be in the business of restoring fish. One, they're not good at it. Two, they're not qualified to be at it. And so those agencies should be defunded in the sense that they need to be responsible for funding restoration, but they should not be the action agency doing the actual recovery.
Amen, Bob.
I want to say a couple quick things that follow on the good comments from Aaron and Bob. There has been a deference to these federal agencies for over 20 years. We've spent billions of dollars, $17-18 billion now, on salmon restoration activities that haven't restored a single population. The opportunity today, and I think the conversation, if we can continue to advance it, is a much more regionally centered conversation. Once again, I'll take my hat off to Congressman Simpson for really opening that conversation up on behalf of sort of Congress and saying what we've been doing is unacceptable and it's got to change. What we need to do, and I think it's having conversations with utilities, and it's reaching out to move the local county commissioners and mayors of central Idaho and community leaders on the coast and people to, engage Congress and say, we've got to have a solution. To move these agencies, I think we've got to have leadership in Congress and from the governors. And the governors are starting to step up, the 4 governors of the Northwest states. We need more from them, and we need more from members of Congress to take control of this issue, work with the region for a regionally led solution along the lines that we've been talking about. It's assembled in a manner that restores Lower Snake River, replaces the services they provide, and it keeps communities whole and active and vibrant. So I'll say that. On SOS's webinar page and on our website, we've got a place you can go to find actions, people to call, messages to deliver, email alerts to send. And I just, the primary targets there are the governors of the Northwest and members of Congress. And I would encourage everyone who's listening to support the organizations that Bob and Aaron represent, but go right ahead and reach out to those offices and push them for leadership and activity and urgency, or we're going to lose something that's irreplaceable and unique and special in our region. So I think everyone's got a role to play to moving Bonneville in the core. That's a hard thing to do. The way to do it, in my book, is through Congress and through the governors. They listen to those kinds of folks. So I just want to make sure people were aware of that resource, because there's been a couple of questions of what do we do? How do we help? I want to pose a question that Eleanor has raised. It's about another set of actors that are intimately linked that have been to this issue and that have been referenced but not explored further, and that is irrigators and farmers. What are the irrigators and farmers saying to you? I just lost the question. On these topics, how do they react? Can you talk a little bit about what that dialogue looks like and what's needed there?
Sorry for dismissing the question on you, Joseph.
No problem.
Yeah. Bob, do you want to?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at this. And you may be having more conversations with irrigators and bargers than myself, Aaron, but again, we meet on a bi-weekly basis, and we have staff in Eastern Washington that are having conversations with those irrigators and farmers, and we're approaching it different. I saw one of the questions being asked about are you asking for dam breaching, and we've been asking for dam breaching for 25 years. We know that's the solution here, but we're kind of coming at it in a different light. After 25 years, we're talking about we still believe dam breaching is going to solve the biggest problem for these fish. But you put up your own barrier when you come to a farmer or an irrigator and saying dam breaching is the only answer here. And we know that's not the case, because dam breaching is going to have impacts on established communities too. We know what it's like to lose jobs and opportunity. We do it every year. We're doing especially this year. So we can be sympathetic and compassionate for the fact that their way of life is going to have to alter as well. And so the new conversation that's coming about is, let's have this collaborative community conversation. We know farmers and irrigators don't want salmon to go extinct. We certainly don't want that to happen, but we can have a civil conversation as rural Oregonians and rural Idahoans with rural farmers in those states in Washington too. So we've been punching against each other for 25 years, and now it's time to come together and find solutions that work for everybody.
Yeah. So, and I guess first I agree. More specifically, I think I would draw a distinction in which conversations we're talking about, because there are the conversations that we have with the structures and the organizations that ostensibly represent farmers and irrigators. And then there are conversations with actual farmers and irrigators, and those are very different things. So in conversations with the structural leaders of those organizations, so whether it be the grain producers associations like barging, there's understandably a pretty fervent clinging to existing systems. Change is hard. It always is. Friction and change is hard. And so when you come to an organization, say that represents barging, and says, I want to get rid of barging, that is a difficult conversation for them to respond well to, and they don't respond well to it, frankly. They want to continue the thing that they are doing. And so those conversations are more difficult. I think where the real opportunity and where the real content lies is those conversations with the people who are actually doing the thing, with actual farmers and with actual irrigators. And at least, and Bob, I think you'd agree with this, but as outfitters, guides, and recreationists in general, one thing we share a huge amount in common with those groups. We both rely on the land. We have this connection to the land. It is not just something we like. It is something that sustains us economically and culturally. It's our memory. It's our sense of place of who we are. I mean, it is us, and we can connect to them on those levels, and we have. There have been outfitters across Idaho who, in particular, following Representative Simpson's statements at the Andrews Center, who have gone out of their way to make those connections, to just have those quiet conversations with folks in a drift boat or in a combine. And I think that is a really important part of how we shift that conversation, because we are not going to shift that conversation with power structures. Power structures have, it's like Max Weber's idea of bureaucracy. It's self-feeding. It wants to sustain itself and it wants to grow. We're not going to have a conversation with a self-feeding bureaucracy or organization. We're going to have that conversation in a meaningful way with the actual people that are the bleeding heart of that body. So to the farmers and irrigators, what are they saying? I think they've also been fed a bad bill of goods. They've been told they should rely on subsidies. They should be told that their neighbors and their partners down the hill on the river are not the same as them, that they're different, and that there should be an animus there. And I think that part of our challenge here is to not try to bludgeon the people on the other side, to not try to bludgeon the irrigators and the farmers, to say, I am, you are me, and to connect with them and to retell the narrative of what is happening here, that you can be better and I can be better. We can all be better in a different future where we're just bold enough to do the thing that we all know we have to do. So let's do the thing like our forefathers did and not be cowards.
Thanks, Aaron. Powerful statements. We're at 20 minutes after the hour. I think I want to take one more question that from Felton, and then provide, Aaron and Bob, both of you, just a chance to sort of make any final closing remarks. Before we go there, Felton's question has to do with heat problems. This has been in the news quite a bit in the last few weeks, and it's been an issue for years, especially in the Lower Snake system. Can you talk about the heat problem and fish impacts caused by the Lower Snake River dams? I've heard the only way to cool the system down below 70 degrees in the summer is by restoring that river, knowing that water temperatures above 68 degrees starts to become harmful and potentially deadly to cold water fish like salmon and steelhead. Either of you want to take that on?
This is your degree. I think this is firmly you.
Well, I'm not intimately familiar with the Snake River. I've done a lot of work understanding temperatures in their relation to wild salmonids, specifically on the North Oregon coast, where I've done some activism around timber harvest and so forth. And so, Aaron, maybe you talk specifically about the Snake River. If you feel qualified to do that, I will say that in the work that I've done around temperatures is that there's a couple of different thresholds. The science says that fish that are forced to reside in waters that exceed 68 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit rather, they will be compromised. They will actually die. They will perish in a matter of, the technical term, as I've read it in the papers, the scientific papers, is they'll die within a matter of days to weeks. Once the temperature exceeds 72 degrees Fahrenheit, those fish die in a matter of hours to days. So obviously the main stem and certainly portions of many of our watersheds in the Columbia Basin meet or exceed those lethal temperatures that happen. There's different layers of temperatures that happen in a specific reservoir. That'll certainly impact where those fish travel, and therefore their susceptibility to being experiencing mortality rates with hydropower generation. So to some degree, that's a little above my pay grade understanding that, but I do know through extensive research that temperatures that exceed 70 degrees Fahrenheit are very lethal to cold water fishes. And so, and Aaron, if you want to chime in here, I know that, again, Joseph being kind of the kingpin of the coalition, there's been some recent lawsuits, I think, by Columbia Riverkeeper that have addressed lethal temperatures in the Columbia Basin. If Aaron, you have information on that, that'd be great to give. If not, maybe Joseph does, because it was kind of a landmark win for fish on the Columbia main stem here that probably should be incorporated into this answer.
Yeah, so I mean, to the extent I can say, well, I guess I can relay some of the information that we've received in presentations from folks certainly more expert than I on the issue in the governor's work group. In short, hot water bad for fish, right? We have less oxygen content. Fish need that oxygen content to survive. Salmonids need that. That things such as, so when we talk about it, oftentimes the conversation is about breach versus drawdown, the different alternatives there, and a lot of that has to do with concerns around turbidity, but potential benefits surrounding velocity. So increased velocity over rapids or in those sections, having a potential cooling effect, overnight cooling, things like that. Whereas if you have these deep reservoirs, the overall cooling effect is mitigated against. Beyond that, I would say, for what the draft environmental impact statement recently released is worth, which is not a lot. They point to, if we breach the dams here, look, the temperature is going to get hotter. I can't speak with authority to their figures, to the Army Corps or the other action agency figures there, but I can say that it seems to be not least judicially supported, but otherwise pretty scientifically supported, that either drawdown or breach and other means toward restoring natural river conditions, both would have positive impact on cooling the river, at least marginally, to a degree that would support salmonid health. Not least that those things would generally get closer to imitating free-flowing river systems, which evolutionary history and otherwise so shows us to be better for their survival.
I can say a couple things, Aaron, to follow on what you and Bob have said, and give you a moment to collect your thoughts before we conclude. But basically what you both have been saying is correct. Hot water is bad for fish. Lower Snake River dams and the reservoirs absorb a tremendous amount of solar radiation that means that water temperatures that used to be in the 60s when it was a free-flowing river, and with occasional day-long or two-day spikes during particularly hot episodes, now are above 68, 70, 72 degrees for weeks on end, starting in mid-July, typically through the end of August. And that's had a tremendously harmful effect on juveniles coming out and adults returning. It's been a long recognized issue. It's been largely unaddressed. It's been highlighted in court rulings in the last 10 years that hot water is a problem and it needs to be addressed, and the agencies have failed to address it repeatedly. And their EIS fails to address it again, this DEIS that they just released in February. It was a major element of the court ruling in 2016, that invalidated the last federal plan and forced the production of the EIS and a new plan. And there is well-founded, well-respected modeling that came out of the Environmental Protection Agency that's 20 years old that talks about what a restored river would do to water temperatures, in particular, in combination with cold water flows that come out of Dworshak Reservoir feeding into the Clearwater. So for folks who don't know that geography, the Clearwater River is a tributary to the Lower Snake, and the Dworshak is a reservoir that feeds water into Clearwater just a few miles upstream. It has very deep cold waters that it can release and can help. It helps today, recent years, cool that what's now the upper reservoir behind Lower Granite Dam near Lewiston, Clarkston. What the modeling shows is a restored river in combination with those cold water releases in Dworshak would cool water temperatures down all the way to where it meets the Columbia River. So it would provide a restored river, cool temperatures, much higher survival, much less predation. It's just a series of benefits that combine that are going to lead to much higher survival and reproduction and returns. The final thing I'll say on this topic is the Columbia Riverkeeper and other organizations in the region have pushed this issue in court and in other arenas. And recently, Oregon and Washington, Governor Inslee, Governor Brown, stepped up and said, we are going to assert this authority we've had all along, but we haven't chosen to use, which is a tool to help force this conversation around keeping water temperatures lower. And the agencies that manage the dams are on the hook to do that, the Army Corps. And so it's another indication and sign, a positive sign in my mind, about the leadership, political leadership in the region is starting to take control of this issue where they've been deferential to the agencies in the past. That's an opportunity, and it's a good sign, and it's a reflection of the fact that the work that Bob and Aaron and their folks are doing, and all of us are, to move the politics into the region, leading, making solutions, solving problems. So that's a recent development on this temperature issue. It's a tremendous one for meeting the needs of the fish, and it's another leverage point in this conversation. I'll stop there. Aaron and Bob, just want to thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise and perspectives this evening. I thought it was a great conversation. I want to give both of you just a couple minutes to share any final thoughts, things that haven't been mentioned that you want to share, and otherwise just help us conclude this conversation. Bob, why don't you go first this time? Since Aaron kicked off on the front end.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for joining tonight. I mean, one of the biggest barriers to getting action on this issue is getting more people involved and informed. I mean, it's, the most recent town hall event in Tillamook County that got Senator Ron Wyden to publicly say he wants to help out on these collaborative conversations that need to happen in these rural communities. So that was the people that pushed that and made that happen. We're not going to get through this issue until we get an avalanche of the public engaging with public officials to make that happen. People way smarter than me on this issue, and I agree with them, of course, are saying, Bonneville Power and the core strategy for this crisis is to hold off on recovery long enough for climate change to put the nail in the coffin for these fish. We can't let that happen. We know that climate change is coming. We have to mitigate freshwater life histories right now to ensure survival of the species in the future. And I would just finally encourage folks to stay engaged with the SOS Save Our Wild Salmon webpage and emails. The organization, and Joseph in particular, does a great job of telling people how to engage on these issues. Contributions are always welcome to the organization. They have just a skeleton staff that's done a tremendous amount of work over the years to keep our fingers in the holes of the dams that we want to take down, so to speak. And so, we're like I mentioned, we were in a great spot before the pandemic hit. We need to make sure that we jumpstart this conversation loud and clear with our electeds after we have this situation taken care of. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. My turn, huh?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Yep. Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, Bob, for the good conversation and for all you both do. I really appreciate it. Yeah, what do you say? You know, I talk to folks all the time, and, you know, Bob, you're one of these, but I talk to folks all the time who have been fighting this fight for decades, who in the 90s were told, just hold on, just grin and bear it. There'll be more fish. We're gonna change some things. There'll be more fish. We're gonna improve habitat. There'll be more fish. We're gonna increase supplementation in hatcheries. There'll be more fish. That they'll recover through all these magical, non-scientifically supported means. And the solutions have been staring us in the face for a long time, but I don't even want to talk so much about the solutions as about the impacts and what it means and how we get there, I guess, in closing, which is to say, the impacts are catastrophic. Morally, culturally, and economically, they are catastrophic. And we would be remiss on all of those levels to ignore this issue, because it's not a down the road issue. It's not a somebody else will solve it issue. It is a now issue that nobody else is going to solve for us. Bonneville is not going to fix itself. The Army Corps of Engineers, Bob, to your point, is not going to fix itself. The only way that we fix this problem is by demanding something different. It's the way that things have always worked in this country. It's that we say, this isn't good enough. We're not going to take your false promises anymore. You're not going to tell us how many fish we get back, and we're not going to shift our baseline to say that's okay. I'll do more with less. We're going to say, this is how you're going to bring our fish back. Now go do it. And the way that we do that is by influencing people, not first congressionally, my opinion, but first by going to our local power co-ops, by going to our county commissioners, by starting the conversations with people with influence in our local areas where we are bleeding out on the kitchen floor over this issue, and make people care, make them angry about it, get them pissed off. Why are we bleeding fish and losing our next generations? Why is this supplanted recreation industry now suffering under diminished returns? We need to, and we can. That's the other good news. And it does require more people, and that is always a problem. And it does require more education, but we can do that. We need to not activate, I hate that term. We need to have those conversations on a local level in a serious way, in a way that doesn't just say, I want wild fish because wild fish, but that says, I want wild fish because I want my kids to stay in town. And I want wild fish because it's important to the longevity of my community. And I want wild fish because they're keystone species and because their DNA is found up that mountain. And I think that's cool. Like we should want them back for those reasons and have those conversations on those levels in ways that actually matter to us, and more importantly, matter for the people we're talking to. And frankly, we should do it right now, because we should have done it 50 years ago.
Aaron, thanks so much. I think you just had the last word. Aaron and Bob, thanks so much for spending the evening with us. Thank you to all who attended and the good questions that came in and discussion that ensued. Keep an eye on our SOS webinar page for links to this webinar, recording of it, as well as the other ones. We'll post some information that Aaron and Bob presented this evening. And there's also places that you can learn more about what you can do to help. Thanks a lot. Have a great evening, and we'll keep fighting. Take good care.
Thanks, Joseph.